Well, it's a little hard to believe, but here I am 22, 23 videos into this channel, and I've only featured one Yashica camera so far. Or two, if you count the Ward's SLR600 that I featured. That was a camera that was manufactured by Yashica. But Yashica branded cameras, I've only featured one. Now it's a little unusual because if you've watched my Ward's SLR600 episode, then you know that I am a huge Yashica fan. And I will have a number of Yashica cameras featured on this channel as time goes by. But today I'm going to be featuring just the second Yashica camera on this channel, and this is the Yashica Half 17 Rapid. Now, Yashica made a whole variety of half 17 cameras throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. Many of them looked very similar to this or were variations on this particular camera. Now, as the name suggests, the half means half frame, and the 17 it means that it has an f1.7 lens. Now, many of the half 17 cameras and any of Yashica's half frame cameras looked very similar. They all featured some kind of electric eye for metering. As you can see, this has a selenium meter that surrounds the lens. Now, all of them were fairly small cameras, as you might expect from a half-frame camera. Very small, easy to carry around. Now, you might be wondering why this camera is called the Half 17 Rapid specifically. If you look closely, the reason might become somewhat obvious. You can see, as I look at the top of the camera, there is no rewind knob. And if you look around, even on the bottom of the camera, there's just a very small winding knob here and not much else in terms of film control. Now, why would that be? Well, you've probably already figured it out. The Rapid in the Yashica Half 17 Rapid means that it is a rapid cartridge camera. You can see that this camera does use the Agfa Rapid cartridge system. So there is no spindle for taking up film. There is no rewind lever. The film just simply travels from one cartridge to another. Now, I do want to spend some time talking about the Rapid cartridge system, but before I do that, I want to go over a few of the features of this specific camera. The features are pretty straightforward. So as I mentioned, it has a selenium meter for metering. It is an automatic exposure camera, so there's nothing to set in terms of aperture or shutter speed. You simply point the camera, and with the meter through the viewfinder, you adjust the exposure control dial. The exposure control dial reads out in EV, so this is actually quite handy. If you want to use an external meter, you can simply measure in EV and plug that right into the camera. The other controls are fairly simple. There is a simple focusing lever here on the lens. The camera features two focusing aids. There is a zone focusing system that is viewable through the viewfinder. There are 4 zones in the zone focusing system, one for close-up photography. This camera can focus down as close as 2.5 feet. And then the standard portrait, group, and landscape settings in the zone focusing system. And then it also includes scale focusing on the lens barrel. There is a scale in feet on the top of the lens barrel and a scale in metric on the bottom of the lens barrel. There is a self-timer function. Obviously on top you've got the shutter release button, a cold shoe, the film counter readout, and then on this side of the camera you've got the PC plug for flash synchronization. And that's about it. There's not a lot of controls on this camera because there just isn't much to control. Now let's talk a little bit about the Rapid cartridge system and what that was and how it works with this specific camera. In the late 1950s going into the 1960s, most lower-level consumer-grade cameras like the Kodak Duoflex and Brownie series of cameras were still using roll film. In the early 1960s, Kodak was looking to broaden the appeal of daily snapshot photography, and they wanted to do this by simplifying the process of loading film into a camera. So in 1963, Kodak introduced the 126 film cartridge. This was an incredibly easy system to use, as the film was entirely contained in a preloaded plastic cassette, and you simply dropped that cassette directly into the camera. So the 126 cassette was immediately successful, and many cameras that use this cassette system hit the market very quickly, which created a huge new market for Kodak. Now Agfa, which was one of Kodak's major competitors, especially in Europe, they were kind of caught off guard by this and immediately obviously wanted to expand into that same consumer level market that Kodak had. So Agfa scrambled to get an equivalent product to market, and just 1 year later, in 1964, they introduced their own easy loading film system, which they called the Rapid system. Now the Agfa Rapid system was similar to the Kodak 126 system in that it was a simple cartridge system that you just drop the cartridge into the camera and then it was ready to go. It differed from the Kodak system in that it did require 2 cartridges, one with the film in it and one empty cartridge to receive the film. Now the question is, how did Agfa get this system to the market so quickly after Kodak had introduced their 126 film cartridge just the year before? Well, this is where the story gets interesting. So Agfa had just simply reused an older cartridge system that they had developed back in the mid-1930s called the Carrot system, which they had produced from 1936 until the early 1950s. And they just did a mild update to that cartridge system to include a film speed indicator and then pushed it out as the Agfa Rapid system. But the system goes back even farther than that. The Agfa Carrot cassette was a development from an original cassette system developed by Ansco back in the 1920s for their Ansco memo camera, which was in 1927. Now I'll do a completely separate video for the Ansco memo system and also for the Agfa Carrot system, but it is interesting to hear that pedigree that started the Agfa Rapid system of the 1960s. So the Agfa Rapid cassette was introduced in 1964, and it did have some advantages over Kodak's 126 system, such as it could use cameras that included pressure plates for the film, since the film emerged from the cassette and then passed to a separate cassette. But it was slightly more complicated than the 126 cartridge. And the Rapid cassette system never saw the success that the Kodak 126 system did and was discontinued by the early 1970s. So I'm going to be reloading an Agfa Rapid cassette to use with the Yashica. The Agfa Rapid cassettes, luckily, are probably the easiest cassette to reload. There's no spindle. There isn't really anything tricky about it. You just push the film in there. So I'm going to be shooting with this Orwo UN54, which is an ISO 100 film. And to load film into the camera, it's pretty basic. You only really need a few simple tools. A ruler to measure out the length of film that you're going to be pushing into the cassette. Scissors, obviously, to cut off the film. I'm going to be using these lint-free cotton gloves just because I will be handling the film and I don't want to get a lot of dust on the film as I'm loading it into the cassette. Now, obviously, the operation is done entirely in the dark, so I can't really film that, but I'll kind of walk through exactly what the process is here. Now, one thing to note, the Orwo UN54 is an ISO 100 speed film, like I mentioned. The Yashica does have automatic exposure that is based on the Rapid cassettes, telling the camera what speed of film is in the camera. So I want to make sure that I'm using a Rapid cassette that has the G label. The G label is for 100 speed film. Not sure you can read that, but it does say G right here on the label. And the way these work is the little tab that extends down, this little extension here, is a different length for different film speeds. This particular one is labeled G. G is for the 100 film speed. So the first step is to simply take a roll of brand new film, and what's going to happen is we're going to start this leader by pushing it into the Rapid cassette, just like that. And then I'm not going to do it now because obviously we're not in the dark, but once I'm in the dark, what I'll do is pull out film from the supply spool here, the supply cassette, and I'm going to measure out with this ruler exactly 2 feet of film in the dark, and then simply cut off the end of that film, push all 2 feet into the Rapid cassette, And then at that point I can turn the lights back on, and I will retrim the leader for the supply reel so that I can continue using that spool, and then put a little bit of shape on the Rapid cassette supply so that it matches the shape that's used by the Rapid film. All in all, pretty straightforward process, so I will go do that now. Okay, so I've got the film loaded into the Rapid cassette, and you can see this is the film supply that I used, the Orwo UN54, and you can see I just did a square cut directly across the film. So there's still another, what we got here, a 36 exposure roll. I've just taken 2 feet for the Rapid cassette. That 2 feet equates to 12 exposures in the Rapid cassette, and by the time you subtract the leader and whatnot, we're probably going to be back down to about, say, 20 exposures left in here. So obviously this is still good. What I'll do is just cut a new leader. That's pretty straightforward. I won't bore you with that, so I'll set this aside for now. Now what I want to do is put a little shape on the leader for the Rapid cassette. Now you can kind of use it just cut square. A lot of people that reload Rapid cassettes will just put a little chamfer in either corner to help it load into the receiving cassette. I like to put the same shape that was used in the original Agfa film. So what I've got here is an original factory loaded Agfa Rapid cassette, still in the box. Obviously long expired. This expired in 1972. I will likely use this film in another video, but for this video I wanted to use fresh film. But what I'm going to use this for is I'm going to use this as a template for that kind of leading edge shape, because it is a little unusual. So if I go ahead and open this box, and again, this is new old stock film, so this, you're seeing it being opened as it was packaged at the factory. I take the insert out. You can see there's the little paperwork that they used to provide you back in the old days that gives you all the information about the film and how to develop it. The cassette itself, which is wrapped in this kind of green tin foil, which I will open up now. And again, I will use this film in a future video, but for now I just want to use this as a template to cut the film that I've just loaded, the fresh film. I had a couple rolls of this and I've shot it before. It is usable, but it is pretty expired and shows a lot of the kind of defects that you get with expired film. So here's what it looked like when it was new. It came with this little leader. And what's kind of cool about the Agfa film, if you can see that, is it actually had the film type imprinted into the film with a kind of a dot cut text. Kind of cool. But the thing I'm after, as you can see, is this shape here. This is, you can see it's kind of scalloped in the center, and then has a little bit of the forward pointing part of the scallop on the two edges. I believe the reason that it's cut that way is because the way Rapid film is advanced is it's advanced entirely by the sprocket holes. So it's being pushed from the two edges. And if you imagine this end of the film entering the receiving cassette, you really want that force to be at the leading edge, which would be these two, the two outside parts of the film, not necessarily the center, which might lead to buckling. If you're pushing from the two outsides and it's receiving in the center, I imagine that would probably be a buckling problem. I think that's why it's cut this way. But regardless, I'm going to try and match that at least approximately with my leading edge. So using that as a template, you can see one of the things we want to make sure we're looking at is the relationship to the sprocket holes. So that leading sprocket hole, there is a little bit of meat outside of the hole. We don't want to cut through a hole. Now, luckily, I've cut mine just perfectly to allow for that little bit of meat there. So I'm going to do this very carefully, but I'm not going to be too fiddly with it. You can see I'm just going to round this off a little bit on the corner. And same thing over here, just to help that kind of enter the receiving canister. And then in the middle, I'll just put a little shallow scallop in there like that. Pretty easy. I'm not being really particular about this. Maybe this is more particular than some of you would be, but that's about it. It's not perfect. And you can see I haven't taken much film. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close. Close enough, I think. Maybe just make sure I've got any little sharp corners trimmed off right at the end, just to make sure it doesn't get hung up. And that's it. Now I've got a Rapid cassette loaded and ready to go with fresh film, Orwell UN54. And again, the 2 feet of film, by the time you subtract out the liters, it is about 12 exposures in the Yashica. Now we're going to load the film into the camera. And so to load the film in the camera, we just need 3 things. 1, the camera, obviously. 2, the fresh film that we've just loaded. And then with the Rapid system, you also need an empty receiving cartridge for the film to go into. The way the Rapid system works is it simply pulls the film out of your supply side, pushes it into your receiving side, and that's it. There's no rewinding. So that was one of the selling points of the Rapid system, was the perceived ease of not having to rewind film, which frankly is not a big deal. Now, I realize I just said that the 2 feet of film in the Rapid cassette will provide me with 12 exposures on the Yashica, but that's not correct. It's 12 exposures on a full frame camera, but on a half frame camera like the Yashica Half 17 Rapid, as the name applies, it's a half frame camera, so I will actually get 24 exposures out of this roll. So to load the film, it's very easy, and this was, again, one of the selling points of the Rapid system that was intended to make it a competitor to Kodak's 126 cartridge system. So you simply open the back. For this particular camera, you load the supply side on the left side of the camera. On some Rapid cameras, you load on the right side. And again, this pin that we were just talking about is going to engage with this pin here on the camera. And depending on how far down that gets pushed, then the camera knows what film speed is in the camera. So there's no setting of films, no manual setting of film speeds. So you simply drop this down in on the left side, and then the empty cartridge goes on the right side. For the empty cartridge, it doesn't matter what cartridge type you use, because this is not telling the camera anything about the film speed. So I'm actually using an E here. You just drop that down into the right side. And the great advantage that they were selling was that's all you have to do. The camera will automatically feed the film into the receiving cartridge. Now, I don't particularly trust that. I want to make sure that I get these pictures. So I actually am going to pre-start the film, which you can do. I'll probably lose a couple of frames. But I'm not too worried about that. So I'm just going to pull out a little bit more film here and then pre-start that in the receiving side. Now, you might be wondering, if I was planning on doing this all along, why did I go to the trouble of shaping that end? And part of it's just practice, and part of it is I have some suspicions that it also helps the receiving film spool itself up. Remember, there's no spool inside of this cartridge. It's just an empty space. So the film has to wind itself inside. And then the last thing to do is just make sure that the film is fully engaged with the sprockets, because that is the only thing that is pushing the film forward. Now, before I close the camera, I want to show, this is one of the big advantages of the Rapid system versus Kodak's 126 system, which is since the film is transported outside of cartridges, you have the opportunity of introducing a pressure plate, which helps keep that film plane perfectly flat and in the right focus plane. So that's a big advantage. Now, all I have to do is close this back up, make sure that it's clicked into place, And then it's going to start on the S, as with most cameras. And I'm simply going to wind this forward. It's a very short throw because it is only a half frame. That's once. That's twice. That's 3 times. And 4 times. Now that's brought me to the last dot ahead of frame 1. I don't want to wind it to frame 1 yet because I don't want to leave the camera cocked. So I will just leave it at that. And now it is ready to take out shooting. And we'll see what this can produce. So I'll just finish up the video here with a little more footage of the Tally-Ho at the Port Townsend Wooden Boat Festival. This boat is phenomenal. If you're interested at all in wooden boats or sailing, I would highly recommend checking out the Sampson Boat Company channel. You can see the complete reconstruction of this boat. And from where Leo started with just the bare rotting hull to what the boat is today is just phenomenal. But anyhow, I want to talk a little bit about the Yashica before we wrap this up. It is a fun camera, like most of the cameras I show here on the channel. It's very pocketable and easy to carry around. It takes great photos. It's got a 6-element lens. Now, being a half-frame camera, obviously one of its weaknesses is the small size of the negatives, so some of the photos tend to be kind of grainy compared to larger negative sizes. Another downside of this camera, which is common to cameras of this type, is the lack of a real focusing aid. So you're basically just kind of guessing, and when you nail focus, the lens is super sharp, but nailing focus is not always easy, especially when you're trying to focus on the fly. You just have the zone focus assistance marks in the viewfinder.
If you want to use the scale focusing, that's a little more accurate, but obviously takes a little more time because you have to look at the outside of the lens barrel, and you also have to guesstimate or measure what your distance is. But for just general shooting, this is a fun camera, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.